When Ella and I got married, I thought I'd landed a dream life. We were that couple people looked up to. I'm not saying we didn't have our ups and downs, but nothing big. We were the picture-perfect family. A decent house in the suburbs, 2 healthy kids, steady jobs. We were safe, solid, a unit. But then, out of nowhere, the ground under us cracked wide open. And it all started the day her old friend Jake called her. Jake was her high school boyfriend. They had one of those epic first love stories. Apparently, he was the popular jock back then, while she was this gorgeous, witty girl everyone loved. They dated all through high school and stayed close, even after they broke up. I'd heard his name a couple of times over the years, usually in stories about her past, and I never thought much of it. He was just a part of her history. I had no reason to worry about some teenage romance. I didn't even think he was in the picture at all until he suddenly reappeared with a story that turned our lives upside down. Jake was dying, she said. She came into the room one day, looking completely pale, and told me he'd reached out. He had terminal cancer, supposedly. His family wasn't around. His friends had drifted away. And now, with just months left, he wanted to make amends and reconnect with the few people he'd really cared about. She looked at me with this pleading expression, asking if it would be all right if they met up just once, maybe to give him some peace. What could I say? I'm not a heartless guy, and while I didn't exactly jump at the idea, I figured it was just a lunch or coffee, right? Just a friendly catch-up with a dying man. I thought it'd be a one-time thing, maybe 2, but then he became a fixture. First, it was weekly visits, then almost daily. I'd come home from work and find her on the phone with him, or getting ready to drop by his place to see how he was doing. Every time I asked how he was, she'd tell me more about how his health was deteriorating and how he didn't have anyone to lean on. She'd tear up when she talked about him, calling it a second chance to support him through the hardest chapter of his life. And somehow, I ended up looking like the bad guy whenever I questioned it. Wouldn't you want someone by your side if you were alone? She'd ask. That shut me up. She was using the he's dying card to end every argument before it began. But something felt off. It wasn't just that she was helping him. I could sense a closeness forming between them that went beyond nostalgia or friendship. I'd catch her staring off into the distance, her eyes clouded with an expression I'd only seen a handful of times, the same look she'd had when we first met. It wasn't pity or sympathy. It was something deeper. A part of me felt ashamed for being suspicious. I mean, the man was supposedly dying. But her behavior, the subtle way she'd start humming after coming back from his place, or the little smile she'd get when a text would pop up on her phone, those weren't the reactions of someone comforting a sick friend. And when I tried to talk to her about it, she brushed me off like I was being paranoid. Then one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I come home from work, and she wasn't there. Usually, she'd text me if she was running late, especially when the kids were at home. I texted her, no response. I called straight to voicemail. Hours went by, and I started to panic, imagining the worst. Finally, around midnight, she walked in with no explanation, no apology. When I asked where she'd been, she mumbled something about losing track of time at Jake's place and went straight to bed. I didn't sleep that night. I kept staring at the ceiling, feeling something dark and bitter churn inside me. She'd always been a bit private, but now it was like she'd put up a wall I couldn't see over. And if I asked her anything, I could tell she'd just accuse me of being paranoid or controlling. Things continued like this for a few more weeks. She was slipping away from me, right in front of my eyes, and there was nothing I could do about it. I became the ghost in my own home, pacing around, barely speaking, while she floated in and out, lost in her thoughts or in Jake's. The worst part was our kids were starting to feel it too. They'd ask why mommy is sad or where did mommy go again. And I had no answers. All I had was this gnawing suspicion. Eventually, I decided to take action. One weekend, while she was out again, I went through her phone. I'd never done anything like that before, but I was desperate. The phone was locked, but her iPad was lying on the couch, and I took my chance, praying the message history was synced. And it was. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through the messages. They were casual at first, the kind of conversations 2 old friends might have. But then the tone changed. The texts got longer, more personal. She was telling him things she didn't tell me, about her fears, about feeling lost. And then there was one message that shattered everything. "I'll always love you, Jake." I never stopped. I remember staring at the screen, my heart racing, my vision blurring as I tried to process what I was seeing. Every memory, every moment we'd shared over the past decade felt like a lie. I trusted her, and she was confessing her love to another man, right there on her screen. But I couldn't let her know I'd seen it. Not yet. I needed to understand exactly what was happening before I confronted her. I decided to follow her. I spent the next few days playing the role of the dutiful husband while inside, I felt like I was falling apart. She'd look at me, smile, and ask me how my day was, and all I could think about was that message. I became obsessive, replaying our conversations, analyzing every text I'd seen between them, searching for clues in the way she'd been acting. It was like I was possessed by the need to know everything. The following weekend, I got my chance. She said she'd be heading out to Jake's place for a while. I forced myself to nod, even managed to smile, though my jaw ached from how hard I was clenching it. As soon as she left, I waited a few minutes, then grabbed my jacket and headed out. I kept my distance, making sure she wouldn't spot me. My heart was pounding as I followed her car, my mind racing with every possibility of what I might find. Part of me hoped I'd been overthinking, that I'd just find them talking, maybe sharing memories. But deep down, I knew better. She parked outside a small, nondescript apartment complex. I watched as she got out, looked around, and then headed inside without hesitation. I waited a minute, then crept closer, adrenaline pushing me forward. I didn't know what I was going to do or say. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. I found a way into the building through a side entrance and started down the hallway, my steps light, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe this was my life, following my own wife like some private investigator. I reached his door, heard voices, laughter, and then, unmistakably, her voice, filled with a warmth I hadn't heard in a long time. Through the crack under the door, I could make out their shadows moving. They were close, intimate. I didn't need to see their faces to know what was happening. Couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like my whole world was collapsing on top of me. I wanted to kick the door down, confront them right then and there, but something stopped me. Some twisted part of me that needed to know just how far this had gone. The door was slightly ajar, so I pushed it just enough to see inside without being noticed. And there they were, sitting close, his hand resting on her cheek as she gazed at him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. He leaned in and they kissed. Not a quick, meaningless kiss, but slow and tender. The kind of kiss that spoke of something deep and familiar. A kiss that told me everything I didn't want to know. I backed away, quietly closing the door, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. My stomach twisted with anger, betrayal, and a sick sense of humiliation. All those weeks, the lies, the pity I'd felt for her dying friend. It was all a sham. She was here, rekindling her first love while I'd been left in the dark, watching our family crumble from the sidelines. I left the building, barely able to keep myself from collapsing right there in the parking lot. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Couldn't go home yet. I couldn't face her with this rage boiling up inside me. I ended up driving around aimlessly, thinking about the years we'd spent together, the memories we'd made, all of it now tainted. My mind kept going back to our wedding vows, her promises, the dreams we'd built, and how she'd thrown them all away. When I finally made it back home, it was late. I sat in the dark living room, waiting for her, my mind running through 100 different things I wanted to say. The door opened, and she walked in, looking surprised to see me up. She gave me that same distant smile, the one she'd been giving me for weeks, like I was just a familiar piece of furniture she no longer had any use for. I forced myself to smile back, pretending like everything was normal, even though I felt anything but. If she knew what I'd seen, she didn't show it. She said she was tired and headed upstairs, leaving me alone in the silence. Couldn't sleep. All I could see was that kiss, the way she looked at him, the way she'd once looked at me. Every part of me was screaming to confront her, to demand answers, to make her tell me the truth. But a voice in my head warned me to wait. I needed to get everything out in the open. I needed undeniable proof, something she couldn't lie her way out of. So I bided my time. Over the next few days, I acted as if nothing had changed, even though every moment felt like torture. When she left to go visit him, I watched her, studying her every move. It was like living with a stranger. She'd come home from these visits, acting more cheerful, lighter. It was as if I didn't even exist. The kids noticed it too, sensing the tension between us, the quiet distance that had formed. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed proof, and I knew exactly where to look. One night, while she was in the shower, I went through her phone again. The messages with Jake were still there, right out in the open. She hadn't even bothered to delete them. It was like she didn't care if I saw them or not. As I scrolled through, I felt a sickening mixture of anger and humiliation. Their conversations were filled with love notes, memories of their high school days, things she'd never shared with me. There were plans for their next date, talk of secret places they wanted to go, even mentions of what could have been if they'd never broken up. But what really tore me apart were the messages about me. In one text, she complained about how boring our life had become, how predictable I was, like I was some sort of inconvenience she had to deal with. She told him she felt alive with him in a way she hadn't felt in years. And Jake? He just ate it up, telling her he was glad he could be there for her, that he'd always been the one for her. The final nail in the coffin came when I found a photo she'd sent him. A picture of herself, smiling, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She'd taken it in our bedroom, our bed, where I'd spent countless nights holding her, loving her. She'd sent it to another man, and he'd replied, calling her his forever. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed next to her, listening to her breathing, wondering how she could lie there so peacefully while tearing our family apart. The anger simmered in my veins, twisting my thoughts, making me question everything. I kept imagining how she'd looked at him, how she'd kissed him, how she'd sent him a photo from the very bed we shared. The betrayal was like a poison I couldn't shake. The next day, I knew what I had to do. I called a friend of mine, Greg, who happened to work in private investigations. I didn't want to drag anyone into this mess, but Greg was someone I could trust to keep things discreet. When I explained the situation, he didn't ask many questions, just listened. He promised to help me get the proof I needed. It felt strange involving someone else, but I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed concrete evidence, something I could confront her with, something that would make her face the truth without any room for excuses. A few days later, Greg called me with updates. He'd followed her to Jake's apartment, capturing photos of her entering and leaving, sometimes hours apart. There were also photos of them out together, holding hands like they were some couple in love. Each image he sent me felt like a punch to the gut, solidifying the reality I was still struggling to accept. She was living a double life, right under my nose, and it was more serious than I'd ever imagined. Then Greg hit me with a bombshell. He'd been able to access Jake's social media profiles, including some private messages. In those messages, Jake wasn't talking like a dying man. In fact, he was making plans, future plans, trips they wanted to take together, events they wanted to attend. He'd even been messaging friends about his reconnection with Ella, talking about their fresh start. Nowhere was there any mention of illness, no hint of a terminal diagnosis. It was like the cancer story didn't exist. My mind spun as I processed what this meant. Had Jake lied about being sick? Had my wife been willingly swept up in some elaborate act? Or was she just another victim of his deception? I didn't know which was worse. If she'd known about the lie, then she'd willingly betrayed me. But if she hadn't known, she was choosing him over our family because she believed in some twisted fairy tale about a dying man's last wish. Either way, she'd let him into our lives, risking everything we'd built. I confronted her the next evening. I didn't tell her everything I knew, just enough to start breaking down the facade. I told her I'd noticed her spending more time away, how I felt like she was becoming distant, even detached. She looked at me, caught off guard, but quickly shifted into that defensive stance she'd started using whenever I brought up Jake. She accused me of being paranoid, of not understanding what it meant to support someone in need. She even had the nerve to tell me I should be ashamed for not wanting her to be there for her friend. When I asked her directly if anything had happened between them, she went quiet. She looked down, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of guilt. But then she looked up with this hardened expression and said, "He's dying. He has no one else. I'm not abandoning him just because you're insecure." Those words hung in the air between us, sharp and cutting. It was like she was daring me to push further, to call her out. I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to throw every bit of evidence I'd gathered in her face. I wanted her to admit it herself. I needed her to see the damage she was doing without me shoving it in her face. So I just nodded, swallowing down the anger and bitterness. I'd wait. Greg continued digging, and what he uncovered left me speechless. Jake wasn't just faking a terminal illness. He'd been scamming people for years. His cancer was a revolving story he used whenever he wanted sympathy, money, or a way to weasel back into people's lives. Greg found several women Jake had reconnected with over the years, always using the same story about his terminal diagnosis and need for closure. And Ella had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. The realization hit me hard. She was lying to me for a man who was lying to her. It felt like an absurd twist, like some cruel joke. I had the proof now, not just of her betrayal but of Jake's manipulation, and I knew it was time to put an end to it. But how? How do you confront your wife, someone you've loved for years, with evidence of her betrayal without tearing both of you apart? I've been patient, but now it was time to act. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat her down. My heart pounded as I laid the photos and messages in front of her. Her face went pale, her mouth falling open as she flipped through the images, disbelief washing over her. I watched as her emotions shifted, shock, anger, and then a flicker of realization that her secret was out. She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes, but I felt nothing but anger and exhaustion. "I know everything, Ella," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I know you've been seeing him. I know you lied to me about why. And I know he's been lying to you about being sick. This isn't just about our marriage anymore. This is about our family, about the lies and betrayal you've brought into our home." She sat there, speechless, her hands trembling. For the first time in weeks, I saw her walls come down, her carefully crafted facade crumble. She opened her mouth, probably to protest, but I cut her off. "I trusted you, Ella," I continued, my voice rising despite myself. "I trusted you with our family, with our home. And you threw it all away for a man who doesn't even have the decency to tell you the truth. You lied to me. You lied to our kids. And for what? Some fantasy about a man who needed you?" She broke down, sobbing, but I felt a cold satisfaction watching her crumble under the weight of her own choices. I'd spent so long in the dark, and now she was the one feeling the consequences. Ella didn't deny it. She sat there, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking. I almost wanted her to try and argue, to give me some excuse, something I could push back on. But she didn't, and maybe that silence hurt more than anything she could have said. There wasn't even a fight left in her. She just looked at me, her face tear-streaked and defeated. For the first time, she didn't look like the woman I'd married. She looked like a stranger who had no idea how we'd gotten here. Eventually, she whispered, "I'm so sorry," but I couldn't hear that. Sorry felt empty, hollow, like a meaningless word she threw at me to soften the blow. It did nothing to ease the fury boiling inside me. "Sorry? That's all you've got?" I could feel my voice shaking, the raw anger bubbling over. "You let him into our lives, Ella. You dragged that lie right into our home, and you made me the bad guy for not understanding. You put our family through hell, all because you wanted to relive some old high school fantasy." She tried to say something, to explain maybe, but I wasn't in the mood for it. I got up and paced the room, the anger and betrayal churning in my chest like acid. I'd imagined this confrontation so many times, but nothing could prepare me for the reality of it. For the sight of her, broken and guilty, sitting in the very place we'd shared so much of our lives. I stopped pacing and looked at her, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, and I felt a wave of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe grief, or maybe just the exhaustion of a heart that had been shattered too many times. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice quiet but laced with the weight of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt she'd forced me to endure. "Why him? Why do this to us?" She stared at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I used to know. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by guilt and regret. "I don't know," she murmured, shaking her head. I thought he needed me. That maybe I needed him, too. When he told me he was dying, I felt this old feeling like I owed it to him. I thought it was just friendship at first, but then, her voice broke, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. But I forced her to keep talking, to keep spilling every ugly detail. I deserved to know just how deep this betrayal ran. And so she told me everything, bit by bit, her words hesitant, dripping with shame. She told me how she'd reconnected with him over a few casual messages, how the terminal illness story had slowly pulled her back in, and how, before she knew it, they were meeting up, reminiscing, rekindling that old flame. "I was stupid," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I got swept up in the past, in this idea that he was my first love, that maybe he was someone I needed to say goodbye to." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I never meant for it to go this far." But that excuse fell flat. I didn't care if she hadn't meant for it to happen. She'd made a choice over and over again to lie, to cheat, to drag me along on this twisted ride. And the worst part? She'd done it for a man who'd lied to her as well. I couldn't believe how far she'd let herself go for some illusion. For a man who clearly had no respect for her or her family. As the reality of her words settled in, I felt a cold, numbing sensation take over. I couldn't keep raging at her. I'd exhausted all the anger I had. Instead, a deep sadness washed over me, one that seemed to bury itself into my bones. I sat down across from her, looking her dead in the eye, and said, "I don't think I can do this, Ella. I don't think I can come back from this." Her face crumpled, and she started sobbing again, reaching for me. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll cut off contact with him. I'll do whatever you need. I made a horrible mistake, but I want to fix this. I love you. I love our family." But those words felt empty now. The woman who loved me wouldn't have betrayed me, wouldn't have made me feel like a stranger in my own home. "Love?" I asked, the bitterness seeping into my tone. "If this is your version of love, then I don't want it. Because real love doesn't destroy people like this." She was crying harder now, begging, trying to convince me that she'd been blinded by nostalgia, by a false idea of who Jake was. But I was done. I'd spent too many sleepless nights, too many hours wondering what I'd done wrong, while she was off playing the role of some savior to a man who didn't even deserve her pity. And now she expected me to just forget, to forgive her because she was sorry? I stood up and looked down at her, feeling nothing but a hollow emptiness where love used to be. "I'm going to stay somewhere else tonight," I told her. "I need to think about what I want to do next, about what's best for the kids." She tried to stop me, to grab my arm, but I pulled away. She kept calling my name as I walked out, but I didn't look back. I drove aimlessly for hours, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The anger, the heartbreak, the betrayal. It all seemed to swirl together, a dark cloud that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I thought about our kids, about the family I'd fought so hard to protect. And here we were, teetering on the edge of ruin, all because of some lie she'd willingly wrapped herself in. I spent that night at a motel, lying in a stiff bed, staring at the ceiling as I tried to figure out what my next move would be. The idea of divorce loomed over me, a shadow that seemed to grow darker and more real with every passing hour. But then I'd think about the kids, about how innocent they were in all of this. How could I tear their world apart because of her choices? How could I make them suffer for her mistakes? I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I just lay there, grappling with the enormity of it all. My mind kept replaying everything. The texts, the lies, the moments when I trusted her without question. And each memory felt like a knife twisting deeper into the wound. By morning, I felt like I'd aged years, the exhaustion weighing down on me like a physical force. When I returned home, Ella was waiting for me, looking pale and worn, as if she hadn't slept either. She started to speak, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm here for the kids, Ella," I said, my voice cold, unyielding. "Not for you." Her face fell, and I saw fresh tears in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I'd given her my heart, my trust, and she'd thrown it all away. Now all I could do was figure out how to pick up the pieces, how to shield our kids from the wreckage she'd created. She'd made her choices, and now I had to make mine. Choices that would shape the rest of our lives. Choices that would determine if there was any part of our family left to save. I spent the next few days in a haze, going through the motions at work, keeping a smile for the kids, but inside, everything felt numb. Ella tried to talk to me several times, begging for another chance, but every time she did, it only reopened the wounds. I couldn't stand the sight of her, and yet, I felt trapped, pulled in different directions. By the duty I felt to my kids, by the faint hope that maybe there was a way out of this mess, and by the overwhelming urge to escape it all. Eventually, I decided we needed to have a real conversation about what came next. The silence, the half-hearted attempts at reconciliation, it was eating away at me. So one evening, after the kids were asleep, I asked her to sit down and talk. I could see the relief in her eyes, like she thought this was her chance to fix things. But for me, this was about clarity, about getting everything out in the open before making any decisions. "Ella, I need to understand why you did this," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I need to know why you'd risk everything we built, everything we've been through. Was it just nostalgia? Or was it something more?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands, and for a moment, I wondered if she'd finally give me the whole truth. She took a deep breath, then began to speak, her words slow, measured, like she was choosing each one carefully. "It was more than nostalgia," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake and we shared something that felt unfinished. It's not an excuse, I know, but when he told me he was dying, I felt this overwhelming need to be there for him. It was like I was trying to fix something that had been broken a long time ago." "Something that had been broken?" I echoed, bitterness creeping into my tone. "What about our life, Ella? Our family? Was that so easy to throw away?" "No," she said, shaking her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I love our family. I love you. I know I failed you. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But with Jake, it was like I was under a spell, like I was someone else. I didn't know how to stop myself from falling back into those feelings." Those words hit me hard. She didn't know how to stop herself. It was a brutal truth, one that revealed just how fragile everything between us really was. But at least she wasn't denying it anymore. She was finally admitting what I'd felt all along, that there was something dark, something inescapable about her attachment to him. "What about the lie, Ella? You knew he wasn't dying. You found out he was playing you, using you. Did you ever consider that he was manipulating you? That he didn't care about you the way he claimed?" Her expression shifted, guilt flooding her face as she struggled to answer. I did suspect something was wrong. I'd started to feel uneasy about his story, especially after you confronted me with the photos and messages. But by then, it was too late. I'd already lied to you so many times, and I didn't know how to back out. I felt trapped, and I kept hoping he was telling the truth, that there was some way to justify what I'd done. Those words were like a slap in the face. She'd hoped he was dying so she could justify it? That level of desperation, the lengths she'd go to convince herself this wasn't all her fault, made me feel even more alienated from her. "Ella, you've been lying to yourself just as much as you've been lying to me," I said, my voice cold. "You wanted to believe he was sick because it made you feel like the good guy, like you were doing something noble. But this isn't a tragedy about a man who needed closure. This is about you betraying me, betraying our family. She started crying again, her hands covering her face as her shoulders shook. I know I was wrong. I know I've lost your trust, that I might have destroyed our marriage. But I'll do anything, to fix this. I don't want to lose you. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe there was some way to come back from this. But even as she cried, even as she swore she'd change, I felt something inside me shut down. The part of me that had once trusted her without question, that had seen her as my partner, my safe place, that part was gone. I didn't know if it would ever come back. I took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Ella, I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way. What you did, it's changed everything. She didn't respond right away, just looked at me, her expression shattered. And for the first time, I saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes, like she was finally grasping the magnitude of what she'd done. We sat there in silence, the distance between us as vast as the betrayal that had brought us to this point. In the days that followed, we tried to keep things civil for the kids. We went about our routines, pretending like everything was normal. But underneath, the tension simmered. I could see her watching me, searching for any sign that I might be willing to forgive her, to give her a second chance. But I wasn't ready. I didn't even know if I'd ever be ready. One evening, I went out for a drink, just to clear my head. I ended up at a quiet bar, nursing a beer and staring into the glass, wondering how it had come to this. The bartender struck up a conversation, asking if I was all right, and for some reason I started talking. I didn't give him details, just told him I was dealing with a rough time in my marriage. He nodded, like he understood, and said, "Sometimes the hardest part is figuring out what you're willing to fight for." That hit me hard. What was I willing to fight for? Was there even anything left to fight for? Ella had broken my trust, shattered the life we'd built, and yet, a part of me still clung to the idea of our family, of the life we'd shared before Jake had come back into the picture. I didn't want to lose that, didn't want to see my kids grow up with separated parents. But I didn't know if I could sacrifice my self-respect just to keep up appearances. I went home that night, more confused than ever, and found Ella waiting up for me. She looked worried, maybe even scared, like she'd been afraid I wouldn't come back. And in that moment, I realized something. She was just as lost as I was. She'd made this mess, but she was trapped in it now, as desperate for a way out as I was. She came over, hesitantly reaching out, her hand hovering near mine. "I want to make this right," she whispered. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to try to rebuild. For us, for the kids." I didn't pull away, but I didn't move closer either. I just stood there, staring at her, feeling the weight of her words. Maybe she did mean it. Maybe she did want to change. But could I ever forget the lies, the betrayal, the damage she'd done to our family? "I don't know, Ella," I said finally, my voice heavy. "I don't know if there's anything left to rebuild. You've shattered everything we had, and I'm not sure I can put it back together." Days turned into weeks. I stayed, mostly for the kids, but the emotional distance between Ella and me felt like an uncrossable chasm. Every time I looked at her, the memories of her betrayal twisted inside me like a knife. Yet, she kept trying. Small gestures here and there, apologetic glances, subtle attempts at conversation. She was desperate to prove she was sorry, that she wanted to make things right. But I felt numb, like all the emotions I'd had for her had been burned away. One night, as I was tucking the kids in, our oldest asked me, "Daddy, why don't you and Mommy smile at each other anymore?" I felt my heart break a little at his question, at the impact our crumbling relationship was having on them. I sat by his bed, brushing his hair back, and assured him, "Mommy and Daddy just have a lot on our minds right now. We love you, buddy. Nothing's going to change that." After I left their room, I lingered in the hallway, the weight of our situation pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo forever. It wasn't fair to the kids, and it wasn't fair to me. I needed to decide if I could forgive her, if I could let go of the hurt enough to rebuild something out of the ashes. But every time I thought about forgiveness, about staying, I remembered the way she'd looked at him, the lies she'd fed me, the deceit she'd brought into our home. A few days later, I made the decision. I told her we needed to talk, and we sat down in the living room, a heavy silence between us. She looked at me, hopeful but wary, as if she was bracing for whatever was coming. "I can't do this, Ella," I said finally, my voice steady but quiet. I've tried. I've tried to find a way to look past it, to forgive you, but I can't. Every time I see you, I remember what you did, and it tears me apart. I don't want to live like this, and I don't want the kids to grow up in a home filled with resentment and distrust." She stared at me, her face crumbling as the reality of my words sank in. "Please don't say that," she whispered, reaching out to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but please don't give up on us. We can get through this. I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do." But there was nothing she could do. The damage was too deep, too ingrained in every moment we'd shared since the betrayal. "I need space, Ella," I said, my voice firm.